BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
There's a war on, and we're making a food programme about it. You might ask, what's food got to do with war? Well, we think quite a lot. I'm Sheila Dillon, and I hope you'll give us a listen.
This was a surprise attack on Israel by the militant Palestinian group Hamas. It's claiming it's launched 5,000 rockets in just 20 minutes.
Dozens of Israeli soldiers and civilians are being held hostage as part of an unprecedented attack by Palestinian militants on Israeli territory.
The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made a speech this evening vowing to take mighty vengeance on Palestinian militants for what he called a black day.
Those horrors inflicted by Hamas in Israel on October the 7th marked a new phase of confrontation in the Gaza Strip. 1,200 people were killed and around 240 taken hostage. Thousands have since been killed in Gaza when Israel launched intense military action. In this programme, we want to find out how a population of 2.2 million people in Gaza, nearly half of them under 18, are surviving day by day. What has the conflict done to the food supply in one of the most densely populated places on earth? How are people feeding themselves and their families? How resilient is the population, given the profound uncertainties they face? What long-abandoned foodways can they fall back on as supplies run low? We've tried to find some answers, even though every day the situation changes. This part of the world has had a long history of conflict. We're following the food story in this programme, but it's almost impossible to separate politics from life in Gaza, and food is central to that life.
2 million people in Gaza have become food insecure overnight. We are trying to get to everyone who needs assistance, especially the priority is for people in shelters.
Abir Etifa from the UN World Food Programme, speaking on a Zoom call with me last week from Cairo, before we'd heard about the 4-day pause in the fighting. She told me that even before this recent conflict, up to 80% of the population of Gaza was receiving some sort of food aid, including vouchers to be spent in local shops and markets.
The situation now is much more dire, of course, because, people, they don't have savings, they don't have anything to live on. And even if they do have money, what can money do to you today in Gaza when you have nothing to buy in shops? All of Gaza's 130 bakeries are no longer operating. Also, the last mill in Gaza, which is needed, of course, to convert the wheat into flour, was bombed and it's now out of service.
You are describing an extremely complex situation. What are the other problems?
First of all, you have an extremely volatile security situation, airstrikes, bombing. No one is safe, not our staff, not our partner staff. We do have food trucks going in on daily basis from the Egyptian side of the border into Gaza, but with the shortage of fuel, it's very difficult to move things around in Gaza.
Right from the start of the conflict, aid agencies were complaining about the difficulty in getting trucks in. Abir told me that's improved somewhat.
It's great that we are seeing more and more trucks, but just for you to understand the capacity and the issues that we have, before the conflict, more than 400 trucks were going in every day carrying commercial supplies. 100 of these trucks would carry food supplies. Today, on a good day, if you have between 40, 50, 60 trucks, it would be great. We need much, much more.
Why is it so difficult for trucks to get through the border?
Because there's only one border crossing point that's open, which is the Rafah border crossing point, and that was for passengers. It was not set up to get all of these commercial trucks coming in. And it's already a complicated process because the trucks go to Rafah, then they move to a village in Israel that's 50 kilometers from the Egyptian border, where they get checked and x-rayed by the Israeli side. Then they move back to Rafah and then they start entering into Gaza. By the time this happens, it's becoming late at night, there's shortage of fuel, and the staff are unable to move things as fast as we need it to happen because, again, small trucks come to load these big loads of commodities that have come from the Egyptian side.
Abir Etifa from the UN World Food Programme. Since recording the interview with Abir, a 4-day pause in fighting has been agreed, which allows more aid and fuel into Gaza. However, Israel has previously said it would not allow the hundreds of thousands of displaced people in the south to return to the north during the pause, as it says the area is still an active war zone. And feeding so many people in these circumstances, even with the extra aid coming in, is a huge challenge. We put the concerns raised by the UN World Food Programme to the government of Israel. They referred us to their website, which, they say, documents support for the Gazan people. Before the current pause, it said, more than 21,000 tons of humanitarian aid has come into Gaza since October the 7th. Around half of that was food, as well as 2 fuel trucks a day. Israel says the amount of aid going into Gaza is determined by how quickly it can be distributed once it's arrived.
Can you hear me now? Is that clear? Yeah, I can hear you very clearly. Yeah.
Karim, could you introduce yourself, your name, and your role with the Gaza Sunbirds?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me, Sheila. So my name is Karim Ali, and I'm the co-founder of the Gaza Sunbirds.
And what are the Gaza Sunbirds?
So the Gaza Sunbirds are a paracycling team based in the Gaza Strip.
Karim Ali is talking to me from not far away, in East London. He helped set up Gaza's paracycling team that has dreams of making it big in international cycling competitions, including the Paralympics. It was set up to give a new ambition to young men who lost limbs as a result of being shot during earlier confrontations. But that's all on hold right now because the team, 20 amputee athletes and 4 staff, has changed its purpose.
The Gaza Sunbirds mission turned into an aid mission, and with an idea of trying to deliver food and necessities to people in their community in a very grassroots and distributed way. You know, if you want to make 200 tubs of food for people, go, do it. And you know, with this slowly, in the last few months, the Gaza Sunbirds have fed more than 50,000 people. And these are paracyclists. They're doing this on one leg, often using their bikes to get around faster.
So, on push bikes, as you can see in social media videos, the Gaza Sunbirds deliver cooked meals and supplies. We wanted to find out how they were getting on, but communication into Gaza has been almost impossible. We were able, though, to get this voice note sent to us via Karim Ali from one of the team, Hazam Suleiman. It was translated by one of our colleagues at BBC Arabic.
إحنا يومنا بنبدأ أول إشي نحن نحصل على المية صالح للشرب مية حلوة.
Every day, the first thing we look for is clean water. Sometimes walking 2 kilometers to get some. But for the last 2 days, we couldn't get any because the water station has been closed. There is no fuel to power it, not even any solar power because of the wind and rain. The bakeries here are not making bread because of a lack of fuel. So we are making bread over wood and coal. The price of a 25 kilogram bag of flour is now at 290 Israeli shekel. The bag lasts around 10 days because we have displaced people living with us. All food prices have gone up. A kilo of chicken was around 6 and 11 shekels and is now costing 15 or 16 shekels.
Paracyclist Hazem Suleiman. To translate, 290 Israeli shekels, the cost of 25 kilograms of flour, is around £62. I asked London-based Karim Ali, co-founder of that group of paracyclists, with the shortage of foods we are hearing about, where is his team in Gaza managing to get supplies from?
We started our mission 5 weeks ago. At the start, we had gone to a bakery to get bread. Some more time progressed, the shelves started getting empty, we started going to farms. Gaza has always had farms in the south. We've been kind of not agriculturally self-sufficient because there's such a high rate of poverty and unemployment in Gaza, but they produce the vegetables that they needed. And so we went to the farms and we started buying directly from the farmers now, buying the vegetables and distributing them to people.
The team are also providing support in the form of clean water to mothers with babies.
The water in Gaza has always been contaminated. I think 98% of water is undrinkable in Gaza. And so children, little children, babies, their mothers can no longer produce milk because they're not eating anymore. And so they have to get the formula milk now. Now, when you get formula milk, now the mother has a choice. Do I mix the formula milk with potentially contaminated water, risking for my child to get sick? Or do I not feed my child and watch them starve? And so they also decided to help with maternal care. They started providing mineral water and providing powdered milk as well. I think they just see it as their responsibility to provide as much as they can to help everybody around them.
Karim Ali from the Gaza Sunbirds, whose 24 members are distributing aid in the south of Gaza, finding food wherever they can and making use of local farms. Jeremy Bowen, the BBC's international editor, first reported from Gaza in the early 90s. He's in the UK now, but is headed back to the region very soon. I asked him how much Gaza has changed over the years.
Back in the 80s, it was possible to drive a car from Israel into Gaza, and people would come in, and there were fish restaurants, there still are, along the seaside there, and people would go there and you could buy fish, you could go to restaurants. But for many years now, certainly since after Hamas took over in 2007, they really tightened things up. Before that, Palestinians could get in and work in Israel, a very important source of income. So there was business that went on, but all that was either strangled or very restricted by security regulations that Israel put in, essentially to squeeze the Hamas administration.
Gaza, we're told, used to be self-sufficient in vegetables and produced a lot of fruit.
Yeah, the one thing that's surprising about Gaza, if you've never been there before, is that while it has some of the most densely populated places on Earth, there's also a surprising amount of open land. Because Gaza was an open agricultural area until the war that created Israel in 1948, when several 100,000 refugees came from what became Israel, and they ended up there, and refugee camps started up. But before that, there were farming families there. And now in Gaza, people make a distinction between whether people are refugees or whether they are people who've owned some land.
Many Palestinians we've spoken to, and this appears to be backed up by the UN's figures on the high percentage of Gazans receiving food aid, talk about Israel keeping Gaza on a diet, as it were, making food production there very difficult. Is that true?
Oh, yeah, I think it is true. For example, in the area leading up to the main checkpoint that you go through to get in there, which is called the Erez crossing, there used to be orange groves. And after the Second Intifada, when there was a lot of violent conflict, I mean, nothing like the current level, but at the time it seemed like a lot, those orange groves were bulldozed by the Israelis, and they basically created a flat wasteland. And if anyone went too close to the wall, they'd either fire over their heads or sometimes they'd fire at them and kill them. And the other on the food side there is the fishing fleet. At different times, depending on the level of tension between Israel and Hamas, there are restrictions put on where those boats can fish. Sometimes they can go, 5 miles or so offshore, and there are Israeli patrols enforcing this. And sometimes, in really hard times, they're not allowed out at all. And that does remove not just a source of income, but a substantial source of food.
Jeremy Bowen, the BBC's international editor, who first visited Gaza in 1991. Leila Al-Haddad is now a writer and speaker on Palestinian and Middle Eastern issues in the USA. But when younger, she worked as a journalist in Gaza before she decided she wanted to tell the territory's story through food. Out of that came the 2012 cookbook, The Gaza Kitchen, co-authored with Maggie Schmidt. Leila now lives near Washington, D.C., but many of her extended family are still in Gaza.
I really felt like the story of Gaza, and by and large, the story of Palestine, was not being told in a way that could accurately convey the everyday struggles of the people. And I also recognized pretty early on that there was something really remarkable about the food itself. So much of our understanding about Gaza is caricatured and mediated in such a way that we can only understand it as a place of bombed out buildings and total destitution. It's very hard for the average person to imagine what ordinary life might be like for Gaza. And that's a really serious problem, because we are then much more likely to be desensitized to the suffering of the people there.
I mean, it's a shock, actually, to read The Gaza Kitchen, because that is what is in one's mind: suffering, hardship, violence. And then suddenly you have pulled together the cooking, the use of wild foods, the conviviality of life there. And it is almost like you convey humanity by bringing alive the food culture there, which I have to shamefacedly say that I thought of Palestinian food, but not that you could write a whole book about Gaza.
I think a lot of people found that aspect surprising. Even other Palestinians. I mean, the food of Gaza has always been particularly renowned throughout Palestine. If you were to ask anyone who makes the best kunafa, they will almost always unanimously say Nablus. And if you ask them, where can you find the best food, they will always say Gaza. And so you have this abundant use of spices and heat in the urban areas. You have the extensive use of seasonal vegetables and grains from the Palestinians coming from the farming interior, as well as fermented yogurt products like kishik, for example. And then you have the very rich seafood traditions of the coastal areas. And so that is kind of a summary of the cuisine. It is very rich, heavily spiced, full of a lot of fresh herbs, a lot of cumin and garlic, a lot of fresh dill.
Since the book was published, Leila has been back to Gaza a number of times, once with the American chef Anthony Bourdain in 2013, and then in 2019 with the British Middle Eastern chef John Gregory Smith, who was filming with the UN World Food Programme. She was stunned then by the changes that had taken place.
Every household that I visited did not have olive oil. And the reason that this is pretty remarkable is because, of course, olive oil is the main fat that has been traditionally consumed and cooked with in Palestine for millennia. They said, well, why would we possibly have olive oil? It's prohibitively expensive. And instead, they were all relying on aid-distributed sunflower or soy oil. Another family I visited were preparing a fish dish, and it was the first time they would be tasting fish in 6 months. And the fish that they were cooking for me was actually an imported frozen fish from Thailand. And this is the case for most Palestinians now in Gaza. They can no longer afford to eat the things that have been traditionally consumed in Gaza for millennia: olive oil, tahina, sesame seed paste, fish. Though these things may be available, they are no longer affordable or accessible to them.
What do you hear from your family? I mean, we're talking on the 16th of November. You know, you have a lot of family still in Gaza.
All of my extended family is in Gaza right now. Half of them are in Gaza City, and the other half are in the southern part of Gaza. They were relying on essentially just eating some biscuits and whatever dried pastas they might have had on hand, noodles, because, of course, there was no fuel, so they couldn't use their gas stove. So they're doing what they can, but they've described it as the worst situation they've ever endured in their entire lives, and they've been in Gaza their entire lives.
So we're talking about a very dire situation.
Yes.
Leila, in watching television reports from Gaza, I see these clay ovens now being used. You write about them in the book as one of the old ways of cooking. What do you think as you watch that as a living way of producing food in these circumstances?
You know, I had mixed emotions because on one hand I thought, like, my God, Netanyahu forced people to resort to cooking in pre-modern ways. And on the other hand, I thought, thank God that people have still retained an inherited this knowledge of how to cook because I don't know what else they would do otherwise. So yeah, I just kind of had this range of emotions. But indeed, the clay oven made a comeback, if one were to put it in that way, by necessity. This was something that was very popular that Maggie and I observed in 2010 and 2011 when we were in Gaza, when there was also an extreme shortage of fuel at the time. Gaza is rich with this red clay that is also used to fashion these clay mortars that are used to grind spices and serve salads. And Gaza is very famous for this really vibrant tomato and dill and chili pepper-based salad known as degga.
Layla Al-Haddad. About 6 years ago, I met another writer at an event in London to celebrate her book, The Palestinian Table. Her name is Reem Kassis. Her parents, one Muslim, one Christian, are from rural areas of Palestine. They moved to Jerusalem, where Reem was born and grew up. Educated in the US, she had a starry business career until she realized she wanted to reconnect with her Palestinian heritage. And like Layla Al-Haddad, she did that through food. She talked to me from her home outside Philadelphia.
Palestinians are resourceful. So even if you have the smallest lot of land next to your house, they will find a way to grow something in it. We also historically have learned how to survive on what the land provides, from foraged greens to weeds even, to thistle. There's so many of those things that have made their way into our diet.
Thinking of wild things, I mean, sumac features heavily in your book. And I remember when I was in the West Bank that it's so widely used in Palestinian food. Mm-hmm. Is that farmed or just picked from the wild?
So it's picked from the wild. It's this a berry type of bush. So you collect these berry bunches, you dry them, and then you grind them and you sift it, because what you're really looking for is the skin of that berry, which is incredibly sour and this vivid, bright, a magenta pink of sorts. And actually Gaza relies on it heavily. And in fact, there's a stew called summa'iyya, which if literally translated would mean dish of sumac. And it's a stew often made with lamb, and sumac is the predominant flavor in it. It's very sour.
So this foraging has been integrated into the dishes, hasn't it? I mean, what are some of the dishes that you make with these thistles and weeds, as you call them?
So there's so many dishes to be made. You know, right now it's olive picking season. One of the weeds that grows around olive trees after it rains is very similar to dandelion in the West. It's very bitter. But one of the dishes we make with it, different dialects might refer to it differently. My family calls it عِلْت. And it's basically sautéed with caramelized onions and then served with fresh lemon squeezed on top. And you can imagine, you know, you have this really, really bitter green. And the contrast is the very sweet onions that have been caramelized and then a sour kick to it. So the flavors sing. I hate to use the cliche more than the sum of its part, but in this case it is. I mean, you have onions, grass, and lemon, essentially, and it tastes delicious.
Reem Kassis. In the north of Israel, in Galilee, miles from Gaza, a not-for-profit organization producing olive oil and other traditional foods is led by a team of Arab and Jewish women. The company, Sindiana of Galilee, is, as its website says, a fair trade organization working to create social change from the ground up. Hadass Lahav, a Jewish Israeli, is its chief executive. I asked her what the impact of the Gaza conflict had been on an organization which is all about Jews and Palestinians working together.
Like everyone in Israel, in the 7th of October, we were in a state of shock. It took me some days to tell myself, listen, what you have done all your life, you see, I'm 70 years old. I'm talking about 40 years of fighting for the rights of the Palestinian people. It took me some days to tell to myself, this is not over. On the contrary, you have to believe, you have to convince other people that this is the only way we can live here. And indeed, with the women of Sindiana, we feel more united than ever. We support each other.
And I know that you also have connections with farmers in the West Bank.
Yes, the war started with the harvest. The harvest started in the beginning of October, and then we had the war. And we had agreements with the Palestinian farmers before the war that we will buy the olive oil, and we agreed on the price, and we agreed on the way it will be transferred from the West Bank to Israel, because there are special restrictions. And then the war started, and it was a big question. What will happen? Will the Palestinian farmers trust us? And I tell you, this is one of the miracles that happened in this war. If you want to tell to your audience miracles that happened, this is one of the miracles, that our relations with the Palestinian farmers have not affected by the war. The trust and the collaboration between us and the Palestinian farmers is strong, like it was before the war and like it will be after the war.
Hadass Lahav of Sindiana of Galilee. So has looking at the food of Gaza made any difference to our understanding of what is happening in that small, crowded place? At the end of my interview with BBC International editor Jeremy Bowen, I mentioned the conversation I'd had with Leila El-Haddad, author of The Gaza Kitchen, who you heard speaking earlier in this programme.
I've got her book. You know, when I travel around the Middle East and around the world, I'm very interested in food and buying local cookbooks, local ingredients, and sometimes in quite sad places. I mean, I remember back in the height of the war in Syria, I was able to get to Damascus quite a bit, and I used to love going and taking pictures, and I went through a phase of, not exactly an original idea, pictures of my lunch and the street food I was eating on Instagram and the likes. And some people would say to me, how can you do that and talk about food and what people eat when there are people starving in the country? It's absolutely immoral. And I said, no, actually, for people here, they're immensely proud of their food traditions. And they also like it when people talk about things they do when they're alive, not just being in a war. So I felt it was a very valid thing to do. But, you know, even as I speak now, I think there'll be people saying, how on earth can you be talking about the food in Gaza when there are people starving there at the moment?
Jeremy Bowen, the BBC's international editor and author of The Making of the Modern Middle East. As he says, there'll be people listening to this saying, how on earth can you be talking about the food of Gaza when there are people starving there right now? And when Israel is mourning the terrible attack of October the 7th, in which 1,200 people died. Well, how can we? Because food, as this programme has tried to show for 44 years, is a way into understanding the big questions, a way in the political fog of grasping what matters. Thanks for listening. Producer Natalie Donovan and I hope you found our dive into the food situation in Gaza a help in understanding that ongoing nightmare.